All right. Today I have Mason Mockabee, one of the partners at Parux. And Parux, we're a digital product studio. A lot of people think we're just a custom software shop, but there's a lot more that goes into building products. Specifically, if we're going to build them for scalability, SaaS-based subscriptions, marketplaces. They're kind of like all of a business in a box type of a thing. So there's a lot of extra peripheral things that we have to do from a product perspective. And knowing that that's the challenge and knowing that that's the uphill battle, one of the things that we try to do is educate our audience on what the top 5% of successful product teams do. There's a lot of data supporting that a lot of digital products that hit the market fail. So don't focus on the 95%, focus on the 5, which is what this whole webinar series is all about. So excited here and going to be talking about design systems with Mason Mockabee today. So Mason, before we get kickstarted, let's talk a little bit about some of these pain points that we feel specifically around the context of design systems. I'll kind of start with one that's a pretty obvious one, and that is if you have a design system, but you're not leveraging it, you're not governed, there's no governance or adherence around it, it can cause some struggles between design and development teams, meaning a missed opportunity. That's just a pretty simple one, right? But you and I have had some conversations around consistency because design systems can help with that consistency. Tell me a little bit about that pain point from a practical insights perspective.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of important also just to talk about kind of what a design system is. It's a design tool that allows developers and designers to collaborate on how an application or a website match and the standards that you're wanting to adhere to. So it's kind of similar to a brand guidelines document, but it goes beyond just branding. It goes into the actual UX and UI of an application. And I think the pain point it's trying to address is a lack of consistency and efficiency when it comes from a handoff from a designer to a developer. Design systems have really gotten popular in the past couple of years. When I started my career, a lot of it was, you were designing in Photoshop and handing it off to a developer and they would kind of take your best attempt at it. And you were doing a lot of different comps for every different screen. It was kind of a slower process. And at the end result was never quite what you envisioned. So you would always have that kind of refactoring period in a project where the designer would come back in, look at what was coded, and then make recommendations to get it closer to that initial design vision.
When we talk about the boost that both designers and developers can get from a design system, obviously that can be a pain point if you're not leveraging it. But just to get into it a little bit deeper with what you said, there can be a consistency, but there can be two perspectives, right? There's the designer going, these are the colors, these are the patterns, these are the shapes, this is the corner radius. These are all the aesthetics that if you put this together and you use these patterns consistently, the interfaces themselves are going to look sharp, professional, and very consistent from what people can see. So that's obviously a very important perspective. But if you flip it around and you talk about the front-end developers that program all these things, they're not just programming to make it look pixel perfect like the designer intended. They're also having what I call performance coding snippets on, man, if for whatever reason, let's say the branding changes and we got to make this master color change or this master font change, can I just change that in one or two locations and everything else, all the cascading style sheets change accordingly?
Yeah.
The architecture which you set these style guidelines with is very important. And a lot of times I see a lot of development teams miss that in that they're ad hoc programming everything over and over and over and over again. So whenever you have a master aesthetic change, there are hundreds of ripple effects and hundreds of places that you need to change the code. And that's what we're talking about. Like, even if the look and feel is great, the plumbing and the architecture to code that look and feel, it needs to be updated, right? So it's a lot less hassle. So it's not just a consistency from a look and feel perspective. It's a consistency on how your developers choose to code to make it easy for themselves for maintenance. So that's a cool part to call out. And not only that, I think the quality of the overall application changes, right? If you have a consistent team of designers that are adding to the design system, and same with the developers, both sides are being given a lot of documentation on this is the standard by which we're moving this thing forward. And hopefully by being strategic, the quality is high and the maintenance costs are low, which is what we're trying to get to as far as being an agile shop. So there you go. There's some of the pain points that we want to address kind of moving forward. But we also like to tell some stories and give some insights, right? So I'll say we recently have worked in the past couple of years with a couple of companies that we worked hard on the design system. The design team, the marketing team, the business teams adhered to the design system, and we leveraged it really good. But at the end of the day, some of the outsourcing or some of the teams that came in and built that front end, there was a mismatch, right? And then certain stakeholders and certain people on teams were going, what's going on? So it's one of those things like, oh, we put in all this effort. What was the mishap there? And sometimes it just comes to discipline, but there can be some other factors. I don't know if you want to share some of the insights, but that's one of the things, like you work so hard to get these designs right. And then when the coders can't deliver an equal look to it, it's kind of a miss, right?
Yeah, the two projects that come to mind are one leveraged our own developer team, and that one went really well. And I think what it really showed the advantages of using a design system. So we had the guidelines we wanted to adhere to, also have a component library that designers and developers can tap into when needed. Really what it allowed us to do is develop screens rapidly. A developer not having to go to a designer and needing a pixel perfect direction, they can kind of extrapolate on their own, and they know that the button in the right corner to add a new record is this style because that's what's in the design system. So there were a lot of advantages there, and really what it ultimately it allowed us to code more and build more of the application because the designers had to be less involved, and really they were just in there as a supporting role, keeping the design system updated and making sure that any major adjustments, any new features that did need to be designed were built properly, and then that was reflected in the design system as well. And then we had another project. We were a little bit insulated from the design team. It was an outsourced team. And frankly, the discipline for the design system and reviewing it wasn't there. We had to do a lot of kind of hand-holding comps to walk through. And the end product, I think they weren't really following some of the guidelines. They were making their own design decisions. And the application was kind of left with some inconsistency in the UI. Things like button colors were different, container sizes were different. Nothing that we couldn't overcome, and we provided some guidance there to help get it closer to what we envisioned. But that little stuff matters when a user goes throughout a large platform and button styles are different all the time. That provides a lot of friction. That consistency in how components look and act from screen to screen is really vital to the success of the venture.
No, I totally agree with it. Let's open up the topic of boosting a little bit, and if it's done right, how it helps. Because here's the thing: it takes a village to build these things, right? It's not like you can hire one or two people and they could just build this entire thing. There's so many disciplines, so many complexities. You need a diverse team to be able to do this. So, in my opinion, yes, there can be some falters of, let's say, skills or talent, depending on who's building stuff. But I would like to place the blame more on leadership, right? If you know how these systems are built and you know that creating these frameworks upfront and these libraries, it really comes down to, hey, from a leadership perspective, we're not going to design and build these projects in silos, meaning designers get to play with it, then there's a handoff, then the developers get involved, and designers and developers not talking. They're like two separate teams, and once it's kind of passed off, there's no interactions. That is a highlight of That's what the 95% does, right? They're not
Mhm.
consistent. They're not congruent. They don't have a strategic relationship between the people that are building the product. We always talk about iteration, prototyping, and validation. And I think you need to combine the experiences of the best of the developers and the best of designers working hand in hand. When you have that culture, a lot easier to have the discipline, a lot easier to manage and maintain these design systems. So that's kind of, I'll start there. That's the caveat to it. But on the flip side, if it's being done right, managed correctly, think about, hey guys, we want to open up a brand new feature. We want to prototype this thing quickly. Well, if you have a library of a whole bunch of pre-built components,
Mhm.
you and I have had that conversation. Okay, we can do a quick little mock-up or walkthrough of these screens, and we can go 100% on a quick scale to quickly mock these up because we're not starting any designs from scratch. We're maybe borrowing 80 to 90% from an existing design system, tweaking the 10%, and then within a day or two, we can actually have some really great screens to show off to stakeholders or whatever the initiative is. That's kind of one insight, right? The other insight is, sometimes designers are just busy doing specific things and they can't always design every single screen for every single part of the application. So developers are stuck with, well, I wish I could have it, but there's a big difference if they can go reference a library and go, well, I kind of have an architecture here that's been pre-designed for me. I'm going to beg, borrow, and steal. I'm going to make up a couple of things, but I'm not going to be developing in an ad hoc way. I'm going to leverage the strategy that's been set by both of these teams working together. If there is a need for a little custom design, that's different, right? That is when you get the designer involved. So just even moving the needle, having that agility, that's a huge speed boost if it's done right. So it really comes down to perspective, but I think the culture and the leadership to enable and foster that kind of opportunity, I think is really important. It's not just by the skills and talents of your team. We also talked about branding. Why don't you speak to our audience a little bit about, design systems don't necessarily have to have a branding component to them, but there's a good reason why sometimes this type of visual documentation is prepared together along with branding.
Yeah, I always like to include branding within the design system, and I think it should work in collaboration with the brand guidelines. And that way that anything that's marketing based, social media, public website, collateral materials matches the digital asset as well. They should have the same standards and the same look and feel between both. So for instance, if you're a SaaS platform, your marketing sales website that's generating leads and getting people to sign up when people enter the application, it should have a consistent feel. It shouldn't look like a whole different company, a whole different product. And I think there's typically what we like to do is, take those brand guidelines, put them within the design system, kind of call them out that these are the brand colors, and then kind of work off those colors and making sure that the other application colors and fonts and interface elements are working within that brand structure. So for instance, if a brand's primary color is like this really nice blue, we want to make sure the other blues we're using for different modalities match that. And there's that consistency in the product.
No, that's a good call out. I mean, ultimately, when we're designing applications, it is in the world of design, but that's different than marketing and branding design, right? So
Mhm.
I'll call out some just key differences, right? You can have whatever colors you want in marketing for certain things, but when you get into an interface, we need to think about usability. So picking colors for buttons, we're looking at contrast ratios. We're looking
Mhm.
at how much it stands out in front of a background. We
Mhm.
want to create variances between light backgrounds and dark backgrounds. And we know that a lot of people are colorblind. So you don't want two buttons with two different choices looking like they're the exact same color to cause confusion, right? Um,
Mhm.
all those little nuances as far as how we pick color, how we pick paddings, how we make things look on a screen from an application, it doesn't mean that we have to use the exact same colors coming from the branding guidelines, but we definitely want to make it feel like a family so it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb. We want to make sure that matches. So bringing in branding and making sure that the branding coloration plays along with the design system, always strategic and always a bonus as far as I'm concerned. Um, let's talk about another thing here. You mentioned you give us a little one-on-one description of what a design system is at a high level. We use certain tools, and it's not like we're using the only tool. There's a variety of tools out there to build design systems. Can you share with us maybe the tool that we use, some other tools that we've used in the past type of a thing, and why we gravitate to leveraging tools to maintain these kind of design systems?
Yeah, so I think design systems are implemented in a couple different ways. We're a small team. We typically work our design system within Figma. And the advantages of that is that so Figma is a prototyping software. If you're not familiar with it, it's kind of like Photoshop, but instead of being dedicated, and this really the main purpose for photo manipulation is for digital product design applications and websites. So there's a lot of great features that are built in, and one of the things they do is they leverage design components, and what that allows me as a designer, for instance, if I'm working in a design system, I can set up a library of button styles. I can set it by size, large, medium, small, different colors. I have a red button, a green button, a blue button. I have reverses of those. Can set them with an icon, without an icon. And then when I'm building my design, I can reference that component. And when I use those components, if I ever make a change to that master component, so let's say I change the color of blue to be a little bit deeper, it'll persist through all the different files in the application that are using that design system. So Figma provides a lot of great tools for design systems that designers can really leverage. There's other prototyping apps out there that can be done as well. The prototyping app space is it's a little bit changing at this moment. Adobe's killing XD and InVision's going away, but there's some other great tools out there. So if it's a prototyping software, there's definitely the ability to work in a design system.
I
For
think the
larger,
modularity that you talk about is kind of a key thing, right? Number
yep,
one, Figma we use for mockups, we use for wireframes, we use for FigJam brainstorming sessions. There's commenting and collaboration, which are super important pieces to make sure that people are reviewing this and giving their pros, their cons, and whatnot to make decisions. We can have interactive flows and links so you can kind of mock up what the experience of an app is without having to program it. Oh, and by the way, we build design systems in it. So we're killing a lot of categories inside of
yeah.
design, inside of one powerful application. And again, it's not just designers that are in there. It could be our developers, it could be our stakeholders, it could be people that are doing reviews. So that's the, huge props to the way Figma created that software. But like you said, it's not the only one, but for us, it just covers the gamut so well. It's very difficult to argue against other type tools type of a thing. We still have Adobe Creative Suite. We use it for very specialized things, but it's huge. Just like we're talking about style sheets, right? Edit a style sheet and it's a master cascading and you're kind of bringing that into the world of design instead of, oh
For
my
sure.
God, I got to update 56 buttons. Let's waste 3 hours of our time going through that rudimentary process. Things are a little bit smarter now. So imagine an app with 100 pieces of interface, one quick style change, and it's all done. Let's focus on the deeper, harder work of design, and let's not just do grunt work and changing colors and buttons type of a thing. So that's pretty cool.
Yep. And I think another way larger corporations do it is with a wiki-like format. So they actually post them online in more of like a formal documentation. And that's pretty nice too, especially for large teams. That way, it's not, hundreds of people accessing a file at one time. They're kind of on a wiki and they're getting that direction from there as well. And I think that's important. I think the other call with design systems, I think we focused a lot on kind of the colors and in UI components, but there's a lot of UX that goes into it too. So in your design system, you can set the accessibility guidelines that you want. So if you're onboarding, let's say, a new designer or a new developer, they can reference that accessibility section and understand what standards you're trying to reach and what you're trying to adhere to. So it goes beyond just, button colors and font styles and things like that. It actually gets into the philosophy of the design as well, and what you're trying to uh, accomplish when designing and then handing off to the coding team.
That's a great call out. When it comes to design, it's not only the micro interactions, it's not just the flows, it's not just considering the user, it's considering behaviors and patterns that we know are the best way to build these things. So just simple things to share with the audience, right? When you're on a mobile phone, there's a reason why a lot of patterns and systems say don't have small buttons, have a button that goes all the way across towards the bottom of the screen, because if you're holding a cell phone, you can easily click on that button with your thumb. So just even placements and gestures and things on a mobile interface, a little bit different than a desktop. Another thing that we talked about is a lot of the systems that we're building are all touch-based because of mobile apps and tablets and whatnot. So the size of certain buttons have to cohere with, there's a certain size on your finger that can click a button, right? Or we build applications for an older audience. So obviously the size and the spacing and the things that they need to interact and click on need to be as clear as possible and as simple as possible to make sure that your fat finger doesn't click 2 or 3 buttons at the same time. When you're considering all these things and you've figured it out, how awesome that it's just already a part of the design system. So when coders are going to come in here and just add on all that stuff, they're building all that accessibility by leveraging that design system, and you don't have to figure it out over and over and over again, which is what adds to that boost. So that's an excellent call out. There is the ugly side of things. There's always a good, a bad, and an ugly, right? I think the bad and the ugly is really making an excuse to not start with a design system. And to be honest with you, we have this conversation with a lot of clients. Just starting a design system, you shouldn't say no to it thinking, oh, this is complicated. This is going to, be so costly. And I don't have a budget for that. Some of the design systems that we built are very simple to start with, but there's so much leverage that you can have. So don't think, over time, the larger company, the larger organization, the larger the application is, obviously, there's a lot of time spent in design systems, but that doesn't mean you can't start simple and easy, right? So I'd say the biggest ugly is not leveraging this at some point in time. And
in my mind, I would say in my mind, it's a non-negotiable at this point. We were working on a little one-pager marketing site, and I started a design system for it because it makes my job easier, right? It's that whole aspect of, if the client says that color is not quite working, let's adjust it. I can make one change and it persists throughout the design. I don't have to go through each element and make that adjustment. So in my mind, every project should have a design system, or at least the start of one. It doesn't have to get blown out into this big thing, but even if it's just a simple marketing thing, it really helps to kind of set that. It doesn't take much effort to create the design file, get that documentation started, and the benefits are huge.
The other thing is it's visual documentation. So you can be what I'll call a non-production team member and still get value and benefit out of it, right? So obviously designers and developers, obviously them using it, it makes a big difference. But let's talk about stakeholders. We talked about prototyping, right? Sometimes stakeholders come to us and go, you know what? We've been listening to the business team. We've been listening to our customers, and there's a whole brand new feature that we have to get out. And we got to experiment with this, and we got to test this, and we got to validate this. And oh, by the way, they're complaining. We got to get this done now. Well, starting a design from scratch with no design system slows that entire process down. Instead of click, drag this component, click, drag this component, you can almost build a quick prototype if you have a great design system within 8 hours. It might not be perfect. I'm not saying perfect, but I'm saying, what about this? And now you're driving visualization to make decisions, because your visualization is going to be very close to what is possible, what can be done, and what can be developed pretty quickly, because you're building based on existing components instead of everything from scratch. So just that alone, and look, you can use prototypes to help sell or validate, which is another huge piece that we talk about that product teams do that are on the 5%. they're validating these concepts. They're not just making ad hoc decisions on their application. So another speed boost there. Here's the thing. There's lots of benefits from it. I kind of have a list of these benefits. So I'm just going to list out a handful at a time. And then let's just do a little back and forth, Mason. The first three that I kind of have lined out are scalability, maintainability, and productivity. So scaling is a huge thing. How do we take this application from this many interface screens to this many interface screens and continue pushing? Because you're always going to want to add value-added features for your customers. This is the foundation to be able to scale and move quickly. If you don't have a design library, it is difficult for design and development teams to really get after it, right? So that's scalability. Talk to me about maintainability and productivity. I mean, we already hit some, but let's really push the needle there on, from your perspective as a leader. You lead teams and you're not just a designer and an in-depth designer that has to talk to developers. Talk to me a little bit about the maintenance and productivity, because you live in it day to day.
Yeah, so maintaining it is definitely something that needs to be done throughout. I think it's important that you're working kind of within the design system almost, and then you're using those assets in your design. I think sometimes when there's a new feature, maybe you're prototyping, and you're creating new things directly within your file, but you need to make sure you're leaving yourself time to take those new assets, those new components, those new styles and guidelines, and put them back in your design system. And I think it's important too that you have like a design check-in specifically for the design system on a periodic basis, where you're kind of cleaning up things, seeing if there's any gaps. Because sometimes if you're designing even directly within the design system, you know, maybe the layout of the design system, things like that, just incremental improvements. It's nice to have a dedicated time to say, I'm going to work within the design system. At large organizations, they have designers that are solely responsible for design systems. And they're helping other designers on other projects, you know, leverage that design system. So it's becoming a pretty big thing in the design world. It's a whole specialty as well. And then from the productivity, you know, I think I've touched a good bit on it, that it just makes your design easier, especially for a very complex design. Even if I'm doing something like a table or a grid view, you know, I like to set components and design within the design system for table elements. That way, if I have to make a change within the table, like reduce the font size, and I have a table that's got hundreds of cells, that all the styles update on their own. So it's pretty important. It makes things really, really streamlined and quicker. And it also makes designers think about not just kind of default states, but like the micro interactions. So if we use buttons as an example, back in the day, I think one thing that would happen a lot in the Photoshop or Illustrator design days is you design a website with a call to action button. And invariably, the developers will come back to you and say, the button looks great, but what happens when you roll over it? What happens when you click on it? And I think it's easy for the designer to kind of just design that first look, hand it off. The design system really makes them think about all the different interactions. And it makes them think about things like accessibility, right? What if someone's not on mobile and there's not a hover state, or they're on a screen reader and there's not exactly a direct hover state? So that focus state is what you need to design as well. And it's not just buttons, it's all different design elements. It really makes you kind of think about those interactions beyond just that default load view.
You know, what you're talking about there is the experience side of UX, right? That's the X. It's how do we make the experience as consistent, memorable, so that people can just get done what they need to get done and they have a joyful experience in going through it. So that's the strategy side of it. The interface side is, well, we've got this well documented, this works. So how do we make sure that we have adherence to it? The next three kind of, I think, go hand in hand, right? We talked about consistency. We talked about both design and code quality. It's not one or the other. It's kind of both. And then better knowledge sharing, right? All of those kind of go hand in hand. Number one, we talked about It can't just be a handoff, and it can't be a see you later. I designed it and I'm never talking to you
Right.
again, Mr. Developer. And the developers have to have buy-in to the design system as well, because that's what's going to go fast for them to go, I can program this, I can call this module, I already have this preset of code, I just got to change a couple of things. It works just as good for them as it does designers. So I think the touch point with you is, it's all good if you're excited and build a design system, but you got to keep the discipline of maintaining it. Because if the maintenance erodes, it gets out of date and people don't care about it, people stop using it. So there's a discipline component. But again, I call that out. That's more on the leadership side. But that's what I refer to as knowledge sharing. It's not just the actual use of these components, it's the I understand that there's hierarchy. And listen, the bigger the teams, or that there's more teams working on different segments, you can do a lot more because all of them have at least this anchor that they're trying to use for that consistency. The next couple, or, how do you avoid the siloed knowledge? I, as a developer, know XYZ. I, as a designer, know XYZ. I, as an analyst, knows this. I, as the business person, knows this. This is living, breathing documentation, but it's visualized. So it's very easy, in my opinion, to pull up stuff, get a red marker, circle, these are the issues. Hey, let's extend the library to have these things. But if everyone's bought into it, oh my God, it can really move the needle for us. I think it also closes that brand product gap that we talked about. The brand looks like this. Well, you don't want it to look like this. And then you get into the application and it's a completely different thing. The brand and the product have to coexist. But it's all about accessibility and usability first, marketing embellishment second. So anyway, I think ultimately, if you are looking to either hire a team or you're looking to manage your existing teams and you haven't asked yourself strategic questions about why we don't have a design system for a digital product, I think it's honestly a huge fail, because there's so many benefits and so many things that we can extract out of it. Any closing comments from you, Mace?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think we kind of covered in pretty good depth the advantages of it. I would just recommend that anyone that's working on a product, consider it. Take the time, if you have one, to review the state of it. Check in with stakeholders and developers and make sure it's being utilized, and with designers that it's being updated, because I think it's a critical asset of any sort of digital company at this point.
Well, thank you very much, Mason. Thank you to everyone. Again, Parux, and what the 5% of successful product teams do, design systems. Remember that one. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Cesar.